This is not a story about personality conflict, nor is it simply about two brothers whose relationship has deteriorated in the public eye. This is a story about structure, about law, duty, and the invisible boundaries that govern a constitutional monarchy. What has changed in recent years is not merely the emotional distance between Prince William and Prince Harry, but the institutional environment surrounding them. Legal disputes, public testimony, and ongoing litigation have introduced a formal dimension to what was once framed as a private familial divide, and that shift matters now because it transforms reconciliation from a personal decision into an institutional calculation. This documentary will argue that the true barrier to reconciliation is not sentiment, pride, or even history, but the legal and structural red line that separates personal healing from institutional risk. The stakes are therefore larger than a single relationship. If reconciliation were to occur without addressing ongoing legal tensions, the monarchy risks appearing inconsistent, reactive, or strategically unclear. If reconciliation remains blocked indefinitely, the institution risks appearing rigid, emotionally detached, and incapable of internal repair. In both scenarios, what is at risk is not merely public sympathy, but public trust in the monarchy's coherence, stability, and continuity. A constitutional monarchy survives not through force, but through belief that its conduct is disciplined, measured, and governed by principle other than impulse. To understand why legal action has become such a significant barrier, one must first understand how the monarchy historically manages internal conflict. The royal institution does not operate like a private family. Disputes cannot simply be resolved through apology, conversation, or time. Every internal disagreement exists within a broader framework of constitutional symbolism. The crown represents continuity, neutrality, and restraint. Any action taken by senior royals, especially in legal contexts, inevitably carries institutional implications, even if those actions are technically private. But this is where the story becomes more complicated. Prince Harry's legal challenges in recent years, particularly those relating to security arrangements, media privacy, and institutional treatment, have moved disputes from the emotional realm into the legal domain. Once a matter becomes legal, it is no longer governed solely by personal discretion. Legal proceedings create documentation, testimony, and adversarial framing. They transform private grievance into public record, and for an institution built on controlled silence and strategic discretion, this shift is profoundly consequential. Historically, the monarchy has relied on a doctrine of distance when faced with internal tension. During the abdication crisis of 1936, the institution chose constitutional stability over personal accommodation. When Edward VIII's personal decisions threatened the integrity of the crown, the monarchy did not negotiate endlessly. It clarified the institutional boundary. The lesson embedded in that moment was not cruelty, but continuity. The crown survives by drawing lines when necessary, even when those lines carry personal course. In a modern context, legal disputes function as a new kind of boundary marker. When a royal figure engages in litigation that intersects with state security, media institutions, or governmental frameworks, the dispute ceases to be merely personal. It enters the realm of constitutional optics. The monarchy must then maintain neutrality while simultaneously protecting its structural legitimacy. This creates a paradox. Reconciliation would require trust. Trust, however, is difficult to rebuild, while legal challenges remain active, because litigation inherently implies contestation. This is the legal barrier. It is not necessarily a formal ultimatum. It is a structural incompatibility between ongoing legal confrontation and institutional reconciliation. From the perspective of the monarchy's operational logic, reconciliation without resolution of legal disputes risks sending a conflicting signal that the institution can be publicly challenged in court while privately restoring relational harmony. Such dual messaging would undermine the monarchy's core image of disciplined consistency. Yet the public narrative often simplifies this dynamic into a personal standoff. That simplification overlooks the deeper tension between duty and exposure. Prince William, as heir to the throne, is not merely a brother. He is a future sovereign in preparation. His decisions are filtered through the lens of institutional continuity rather than personal preference. Any reconciliation he participates in must align with the long-term credibility of the crown. This is where the concept of the institutional red line becomes essential. The monarchy's red lines are rarely announced publicly. They are maintained through conduct rather than declaration. Silence becomes policy. Distance becomes messaging. Stability becomes the visible outcome of invisible boundaries. Legal disputes, especially those that challenge aspects of royal treatment or security frameworks, may be perceived internally as crossing into territory where personal reconciliation becomes strategically constrained. But this raises an important question. Is legal action inherently incompatible with reconciliation, or does it merely complicate the timing of it? Historically, the monarchy has demonstrated a preference for resolving disputes through quiet negotiation rather than public confrontation. Even during periods of significant familial tension in the late 20th century, public legal conflict between senior royals remained limited. Disagreements were managed through controlled communication, mediated dialogue, and institutional containment. The modern media landscape, however, has altered that calculus. Public testimony, televised interviews, and legal filings create a continuous narrative environment in which silence is interpreted as strategy rather than neutrality. This environment intensifies the contrast between stability and attention. Prince William's public role emphasizes continuity, restraint, and predictability. His communication style is measured, his engagement structured, and his institutional positioning aligned with long-term succession. Prince Harry's post-royal trajectory, by contrast, has involved public articulation, legal advocacy, and narrative engagement. Neither approach is inherently illegitimate, but they operate according to different logics. One prioritizes institutional stability, the other prioritizes personal testimony and legal redress. And here, the tension becomes structural rather than emotional, because reconciliation between two individuals operating under different logics requires alignment of frameworks, not merely alignment of feelings. If one framework involves active legal contestation and the other involves institutional preservation, the path to reconciliation becomes procedurally complex. It is not blocked by hostility alone, but by incompatibility of operational context. This is why the legal dimension cannot be dismissed as a secondary issue. Legal proceedings generate timelines, obligations, and public disclosures that cannot be easily paused for private reconciliation. Even informal dialogue must be carefully calibrated to avoid influencing ongoing cases or appearing strategically motivated. For a monarchy that must maintain constitutional neutrality, engagement during active legal disputes could be interpreted as interference, favoritism, or strategic positioning. The institution, therefore, defaults to caution, but caution, over time, can be interpreted as distance, and distance, when prolonged, reshapes public perception of familial relationships. This perception cycle creates an additional layer of pressure. The public expects resolution. Media narratives amplify division. Institutional silence preserves neutrality, but allows speculation to flourish. The result is a sustained narrative tension that neither side can fully control. However, the monarchy's historical pattern suggests that time is often used as a stabilizing mechanism, rather than engaging reactively. The institution allows legal, personal, and public processes to unfold independently before recalibrating relational dynamics. This approach reflects a long-standing institutional belief that stability is achieved through endurance rather than immediate resolution. Yet endurance is not without course. As legal disputes continue, the symbolic distance between William and Harry becomes normalized. What began as a situational divide gradually becomes an institutional reality. Reconciliation, once framed as inevitable over time, becomes contingent on structural alignment. Legal action, therefore, functions not as a permanent barrier, but as a delaying mechanism that reshapes the conditions under which reconciliation could occur. This brings us to the question of trust. Trust within royal structures is not merely emotional, it is procedural. It involves confidentiality, predictability, and alignment with institutional expectations. Legal disputes, by their nature, introduce adversarial frameworks that can erode procedural trust even when personal goodwill remains possible. From an institutional perspective, reconciliation without restoration of procedural trust would appear unstable, and instability is precisely what the monarchy seeks to avoid. The Crown's legitimacy depends on an image of disciplined continuity. Every visible action must reinforce the perception that the institution operates according to consistent principles. If reconciliation were perceived as occurring while legal challenges remained active, critics might interpret it as strategic inconsistency. Supporters might interpret it as compassion. The institution must weigh both interpretations simultaneously. But this is where the deeper analytical insight emerges. The legal barrier is not solely about litigation itself. It is about narrative authority. Legal proceedings create narratives grounded in evidence, testimony, and legal argumentation. These narratives coexist with media narratives and institutional narratives. Reconciliation would require harmonizing these competing storylines into a coherent public framework. Without that coherence, reconciliation risks appearing performative rather than substantive. Historically, the monarchy has avoided performative reconciliation in favor of gradual normalization. Relationships may evolve privately long before public optics shift. This approach protects institutional dignity while allowing personal dynamics to recalibrate outside the pressure of immediate scrutiny. And yet, the modern media cycle challenges this slow ontology. Constant coverage compresses timelines. Silence is analyzed in real time. Every absence is interpreted. Every appearance is compared. Under such conditions, legal disputes become symbolic anchors for broader narratives about division, loyalty, and institutional integrity. From a constitutional standpoint, Prince William's position further complicates the situation. As heir, his conduct must align with the future expectations of kingship. Any decision regarding reconciliation cannot appear reactive or emotionally driven. It must reflect strategic consistency with the long-term image of the Crown. This requirement does not eliminate the possibility of reconciliation. It reframes it as a matter of institutional timing rather than personal readiness. And this distinction is crucial because it suggests that the legal barrier is less about permanent refusal and more about conditional alignment. If legal disputes were resolved, de-escalated, or reframed, the structural conditions for reconciliation would shift significantly. Without that shift, reconciliation remains entangled in legal optics that the monarchy cannot publicly navigate. Ultimately, the institutional red line is not a declaration. It is a pasture shaped by history, reinforced by protocol, and sustained by the monarchy's fundamental commitment to stability over spectacle, duty over exposure, and continuity over narrative volatility. And so the central question remains unresolved, not because reconciliation is impossible, but because the legal framework surrounding the dispute continues to define the context in which reconciliation must occur. If the legal dimension represents the structural barrier today, then the future of reconciliation may depend not on emotional change, but on procedural transformation, not on public statements, but on the quiet recalibration of legal, institutional, and symbolic alignment. Because in the monarchy, reconciliation is never just about forgiveness. It is about timing, structure, and the preservation of institutional coherence in the face of modern exposure. And as the legal narrative continues to unfold, the deeper issue is not whether reconciliation will happen, but under what conditions it can occur without compromising the very stability the institution exists to protect, which leaves us with a final, forward-looking question that extends beyond individual relationships and into the future of the Crown itself. If modern royal disputes increasingly unfold in legal and public arenas rather than private ones, can the monarchy maintain its traditional model of silent entrance, or will it be compelled to redefine how reconciliation, duty, and institutional red lines coexist in an era of constant exposure? Which brings the analysis to its most consequential layer, because the conclusion of this question is not a verdict on character, but an examination of institutional evolution under pressure. If the legal barrier to reconciliation has become the defining constraint in the relationship between William and Harry, then the broader implication is that modern monarchy is no longer insulated from procedural conflict in the way it once was. Disputes that might previously have been contained within private channels are now refracted through courts, public records, and ongoing legal narratives that exist independently of palace messaging. This transforms reconciliation from a personal possibility into a structural negotiation, governed by optics, timing, and institutional risk tolerance. In this sense, the so-called institutional red line is less a rigid prohibition than a protective mechanism. It signals that reconciliation, if it is to occur, must not undermine the monarchy's foundational image of consistency. A future king cannot appear to oscillate between legal confrontation and symbolic unity without risking the perception of strategic incoherence. The Crown's authority rests not on emotional transparency, but on disciplined predictability, and predictability, once disrupted, must be carefully restored through sustained behavioral alignment rather than isolated gestures. But this is where the deeper historical pattern reasserts itself. The monarchy has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to absorb internal fracture over extended periods, often allowing time to recalibrate relationships that appeared permanently strained in the moment. The conflicts of the late 20th century, the abdication crisis, and even earlier dynastic tensions all reveal the same institutional instinct: delay visible resolution until structural stability can accommodate it. Reconciliation, in this model, is not denied. It is sequenced. It occurs only when the surrounding conditions no longer threaten institutional coherence. From this perspective, the legal dimension becomes less a permanent barrier and more a temporal one. Legal action introduces a formal narrative that cannot be easily disentangled from public interpretation. While litigation continues, any visible reconciliation risks being interpreted as strategic, conditional, or performative. Such interpretations would weaken the monarchy's cultivated posture of neutrality. Silence, therefore, becomes not avoidance, but strategic containment. Yet containment is not without long-term consequence. Sustained distance, even when procedurally justified, gradually reshapes public perception of permanence. What begins as a temporary structural pause can be interpreted as an enduring personal rupture. Over time, the distinction between institutional caution and emotional separation becomes blurred in the public imagination. This is the paradox of modern royal communication. The more the institution preserves silence to maintain stability, the more external narratives fill the interpretive vacuum. And those narratives increasingly frame reconciliation as a moral question rather than a procedural one. But monarchy does not operate primarily in the moral register. It operates in the constitutional and symbolic register. The future king's actions must be measured not only against familial expectation, but against the enduring credibility of the Crown as an institution that prioritizes duty over impulse and continuity over spectacle. If reconciliation were to occur without addressing the legal dimension, it could be perceived as privileging personal resolution over institutional discipline. Conversely, if reconciliation remains indefinitely delayed, it risks reinforcing the perception that institutional rigidity outweighs humane flexibility. This dual risk defines the present equilibrium. Stability requires distance, yet legitimacy in a modern era also requires visible humanity. Silence preserves institutional coherence, yet excessive silence can be interpreted as emotional detachment. Duty demands restraint, yet public culture increasingly rewards openness. The monarchy must navigate these competing pressures without appearing to abandon its core identity. In this context, the legal barrier functions as a focal point for a larger structural transformation. It illustrates how contemporary royal disputes are shaped not only by tradition, but by modern legal frameworks, media ecosystems, and evolving public expectations of transparency. The Crown can no longer rely solely on precedents to manage conflict, because the mechanisms of exposure have changed. Legal filings, public testimony, and ongoing litigation create durable narratives that persist regardless of institutional silence. This persistence alters the timeline of reconciliation, where previous royal fractures could be quietly reabsorbed through time and distance. Legal narratives extend the life of conflict beyond the immediate moment. They anchor disputes in formal processes that cannot be easily accelerated or symbolically bypassed. Reconciliation, therefore, must align not only with emotional readiness, but with procedural resolution. Until that alignment exists, the institutional red line remains functionally intact, and yet, it would be analytically incomplete to interpret this red line as immutable. Institutional boundaries within monarchy have historically demonstrated a capacity for gradual recalibration. What appears fixed in one era can evolve in another, provided the evolution is framed as continuity rather than concession. If legal tensions were to diminish over time, the structural constraints surrounding reconciliation would correspondingly soften. In such a scenario, reconciliation could be presented not as reversal, but as natural progression within a stabilized institutional context. This possibility underscores a critical insight. The monarchy's approach to reconciliation is rarely immediate, but it is also rarely absolute. Instead, it operates through phased normalization. Public narratives shift incrementally. Symbolic gestures appear cautiously. Structural alignment is restored before visible relational warmth is reintroduced. This method minimizes institutional shock while allowing personal relationships to evolve within protected boundaries. But the broader implication extends beyond one familial dynamic. If modern royal disputes increasingly intersect with legal frameworks, the monarchy may be entering an era in which institutional red lines are defined as much by procedural exposure as by tradition. Legal action, media scrutiny, and public interpretation now form an interconnected system that shapes how royal relationships can be managed. The institution's historic reliance on silent entrance is being tested by a landscape in which silence coexists with persistent legal visibility. This tension raises a forward-looking, institutional question. Can the monarchy sustain its traditional model of restrained conflict management in a context where disputes generate continuous legal and media narratives, or will it be compelled to develop new forms of calibrated transparency that preserve stability while acknowledging modern expectations of accountability and openness? The answer may not emerge through a single reconciliation event, but through the gradual evolution of institutional practice, because ultimately, the legal barrier to reconciliation is not solely about William and Harry. It is a case study in how hereditary institutions adapt to contemporary mechanisms of conflict. It reflects the ongoing negotiation between historical protocol and modern exposure, between symbolic authority and procedural scrutiny, between the enduring logic of the Crown and the accelerating pace of public interpretation. And this is where the thesis returns with greater clarity. What has changed is not simply the relationship between two brothers, but the structural environment in which reconciliation does now occur. Why it matters now is because that environment, shaped by law, media, and institutional risk management, redefines the conditions under which unity can be credibly restored. And what this documentary has demonstrated is that the institutional red line is less an emotional boundary than a procedural safeguard designed to protect the long-term coherence of the monarchy. If reconciliation is to happen, it will likely emerge not from sudden emotional resolution, but from a convergence of structural stability, procedural closure, and carefully managed symbolic alignment. Until such convergence exists, distance may continue to function not as rejection, but as institutional discipline, which leaves a final, reflective consideration rather than a reactive conclusion. In an era where royal narratives unfold through courts as well as ceremonies, and through legal documentation as well as symbolic tradition, will the future of reconciliation within the monarchy be determined more by procedural resolution than by personal reconciliation, and if so, what does that reveal about the evolving nature of duty, legitimacy, and institutional entrance in the modern crown?